Hello, it's time for another Business Analysis Live. I'm happy that you're joining us today. Thank you. I'm Susan Moore. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at the International Institute of Business Analysis. What are we talking about today? Today, we are going to talk about what business analysis professionals need to know about Agile. Maybe you think that you know, and maybe that's based on your experience. Maybe that is based on what your leaders in your organization are telling you you should know. But maybe there's some other stuff that you might want to know. And I've brought somebody on as a guest today who talks about it, who thinks about it, and it should be an interesting conversation. So I want to welcome to the stage Kent McDonald. How are you, Kent?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. We love talking about this. I mean, we were getting ready today, and we have actually already had a great conversation. So now we're going to loop in the rest of the audience. Um, Before we do that, you've been on a couple of weeks
hmm
ago, and by the way, that was a great podcast. We've done a couple of snippets of it, and I'll make sure that we include that in the resources if people want to take a look at it, because we were talking about and having a little bit of fun with prioritization. Remember the controversy we started when we said Moscow?
hmm
We were like, that's not the only thing out there. Um, for those who may not have caught us on that one, why don't you just give a quick introduction?
Sure. So, my name is Kent McDonald. I am currently a freelance product manager and writer, but my history has taken me from being an industrial engineer grad to string and wiring harnesses for Saturn last century to falling into an accidental BA role because joined an IT consultancy and they said, well, we want to teach you about IT, so we're going to have you do this thing called business analysis. So did that for a while, did the normal rotation of BA/project manager type things. Discovered Agile on the discount book table of the local Barnes and Noble. Did some stints as Agile coach, did some more stints as a project manager, got into product ownership, product management, and now I'm a freelance product manager and writer
Yeah, and a speaker.
and a speaker.
Yes, and we say that because you're going to be at BBC in a couple of weeks, and you've
hmm
got 3 sessions.
3 sessions. Yep.
Yeah, so you are thinking a lot about um, product and agile and business analysis and all of those intersections. Well, so we started our prep today with just kind of talking about agile and the state of agile these days. Maybe we share with our audience how do you think agile is going today in organizations?
And in order to talk about that, yeah, I think you have to differentiate between how it's being used
Mm-hmm.
and what the people who have tied their careers to it are experiencing.
Yeah.
And so I've got a fairly long history with the whole agile software development world, having started in 2004. Not when it got started, but um, shortly thereafter. Spent a lot of time working with Agile Alliance. I was a conference chair for Agile 2013. And what I found at the very beginning was there was a lot of when Agile was new and exciting and the weird thing that people were trying out, there was a lot of people kind of poo-pooing it. Usually folks that had never tried it, saying that how it was so disorganized and so anarchic and so strange that we would certainly never want to develop software by that way. And as things progressed and as it became more popular and some people had success and other people found out about it and looked for ways to monetize it, it eventually kind of became the way we tend to kind of work. And then what the ironic thing that's happening is that now people are again being derisive about Agile, but now it's because it seems like it's too regimented and too formulaic and too process driven. So it's kind of this weird cycle it's gone through, this pendulum where Agile is bad because it's too anarchic. Now Agile is bad because it's too structured. And I think that has happened because not so much that the principles and values have really changed, but because people that were trying to adopt Agile in their organizations lost sight that it's really a means to an end, a means to effectively develop software more effectively. Um, and they got hung up and got enamored with the process and the techniques and forgot why they were doing it in the first place, which, and because of those things, it makes sense that people are looking at it derisively now.
Yeah, that they lost their way. I know I was telling you the story of being at BA and Beyond, which has been going on for the last 2 weeks over in Europe. And we were doing a workshop to understand things that box us in. And one of the things that we said boxed us in was falling in love with method, whatever that
Mhm.
method is. But one of those methods clearly was Agile. And so we spent some time talking about what happens when we're in that Agile box. So there's the rise of certifications and consulting, because if leaders hear that word and they're like, "Oh, it can make me faster or better quality. I'd like to buy some of that, please." And so that, what did you call it? Agile industrial
The Agile
complex?
industrial complex, yes.
Yeah, that builds up around it, and then in a way, it's no longer the soft, fluffy box, but it's the hard,
Mhm.
defined box around us. And there's just ends up being a lot of things that get lost in translation, that I think in particular impact business analysis professionals.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and in fact, I think the reason why a lot of people initially, when they were looking at, there are a couple of reasons why people, when an Agile software development first became a thing, that people would look at it and say this is too anarchic, is because those early practitioners of it were treating it as such as, well, it's generally a set of guiding principles that we use to determine what we're going to do in our situation and do that. So sure, from people that were used to working at very phase-based approaches, it looked a very, very chaotic. Um, what happened again is as more and more organizations started adopting it and were getting trained by people that maybe hadn't even done it themselves before they started training others on how to do it.
great point.
They focused on the principles, or on the, excuse me, on the process and the techniques, without really understanding why those things would be helpful, and without really figuring out, does it make sense in this particular context? And then that's where you have all this guidance that's along the lines of, oh, if you have to do user stories in the as a I want so that format, the Scrum guide doesn't mention anything about business analysts, so we don't need them. I know there are some organizations that got told that bad advice,
Yep.
and things like that, as opposed to understanding, well, what we're really trying to do is figure out how we can shorten the feedback cycle so we can learn quickly, realize that we don't know much about the problem or the solution at the beginning, so we got to figure out how can we learn about it along the way, how can we best collaborate. If you focus on those aspects of it and then figure out what are the best ways to do it in our situation, your results might be a bit different.
Yeah, I was telling you the story of working for a CIO, and this would have been probably 2008 or 2009. And there were some prescriptive agile practices just coming onto the market at that time. And he said, "I am not interested in agile words. I am not interested in things that we bring in and start doing." He recognized that he had good people, and that we were doing some things that didn't always help us. We were doing some things that really did help us. And so for him, agility meant analyzing what was happening and being able to understand where we had these blockers, and then addressing it, letting the teams actually figure out how we wanted to address it. Like, we had chaos in our test environments. I'm sure
Mhm.
that sounds like a familiar problem. Well, we put a working group together, to understand what are the ways that we could be developing so that we're not stepping on each other's code, and keeping our test environments clean. That's a form of agility. And it looked different because we were looking at ourselves and tailoring for us, as opposed to bringing somebody in who said, "Trust me, it works." Um, and actually, when I finally got to the organization that did that, I realized how much that did not work.
Mhm.
So, all right. Well, so I think probably with that introduction, I bet we've got folks out there that are shaking their heads like, "Yes, I know these smells of bad agile." So maybe let's talk a little bit about what we would want business analysis professionals to know. Maybe it's not coming from a C level or a leader. Maybe it is something that is going to have to be more grassroots. What might be something that we want business analysis professionals to know about Agile and their ability to be Agile?
hmm I think there's a few things, and a few years back when we were in kind of the mode of convincing business analysts that Agile is not a bad thing back early on, when it was kind of, people were looking at it saying, oh, they're saying that they shouldn't do any documentation. That seems like a bad thing. Why don't we, why do we want, would we want to do this? A couple of the things that I think are important to understand from an Agile standpoint is, again, it's looking back as to what it was really trying to accomplish. And it was originally started by the virtue of folks that were doing software development and got together and said, we've got these different approaches for doing software development that seems to work fairly well for us. Let's get together and talk about how those things are common. And so the result of that was meeting in a ski lodge in February 2001 in Salt Lake, outside of Salt Lake City. And they came up with the manifesto, which again is just a kind of a status report as far as saying, when we've been doing Agile software development, these are things we've found that seem to work pretty good. One of those being is collaborating with the customer to understand, again, what is it they're trying to accomplish. And so there's a variety of different ways you can do that. It's unfortunately become morphed into the Mad Libs form of user stories, which the way user stories are done right now, they're a complete misinterpretation of what the original intent was by the guy named Kent Beck, who created them, which is basically saying, let's talk some stories about how the people that are using our software are using it, so we can understand it, so we can figure out what's the best way to help them accomplish that, help them get to an outcome. Which doesn't necessarily drive immediately to say I want so that. It's really more along the lines of saying, as we're laying out how we're going to be working on this thing, it's not a matter of describing our work in terms of tasks that we have to do. More so, it's along the lines of what are some things we need to help our users get accomplished. So it's what is this system, what is this product, this system supposed to do, as opposed to what are the steps we need to take to get there, which is what the old phase-based project management approach to scheduling things out used to look like. The other key things with it is that we want to figure out how can we learn things quickly. So it's that short feedback cycle, right? And so that's where the idea of iterations came up, is that we're going to do something fairly quickly, deliver it, get feedback on it, and adjust, as opposed to saying that we're going to establish this really long list of requirements at the very beginning when we know the least about what it is we're trying to accomplish, without realizing that we're probably wrong on about 90% of those things.
Yeah. So I wrote down really the things that we could be doing are supporting that ability to learn quickly. Because I think that's really, I think that is one of the things that we were hoping to get out of these Agile way of working, that we wanted to be able to learn things, but also we support collaboration. In some ways, that may be the thing that we are really there for, is um, to to create an environment where we can collaborate and we can share this information in a safe way, in a repetitive way, in a way that supports that ability to learn quickly. I was sharing the story with you that CIO who said, um, I want us to work better. That was his goal for being Agile. I want us to work better. In his mind, it was being able to collaborate. And so one of the ways that he supported that was he had us create a task force that looked at how we had meetings, because we were spending a whole lot of time with stakeholders, and very often, those folks are accountable for, the profit and the revenue and reducing loss. Like, they had day jobs, and it wasn't just to talk to us IT people. So he wanted us, as a show of respect, to be able to use their time wisely every time. And I really didn't think about the results of that until we put that into practice, and it actually did improve our collaboration. Um, and I don't think a lot of organizations think about that piece. They think about, well, there's code, there's testing, and
Mhm.
that's a form of collateral. We don't really have collateral except when it comes to collaboration and communication.
Yeah, and one of the I think probably one of the biggest things from a business analysis standpoint is um, that an agile perspective helps out with is the idea is that um, speaking of collateral, we shouldn't put all of our worth in the end product of a requirements document, because frankly, I hate to say this, but no one really cares. At the end of the day,
That's right.
what they're really interested in is what is this system, what is this product going to be able to do for us. So probably one of the biggest shifts for a lot of people that have had experience working, and this is now going back several years, so there might not be that many people that have had this experience of doing the really long requirements documents, is you're much better off doing a really broad swath to begin with to figure out kind of just generally what's the overall boundaries of what we're trying to do, but don't go deep on anything until you're getting ready to actually approach it. And so that's one of the main ways where business analysis folks can apply the whole feedback and short feedback cycles. We know we're going to generally do this broad swath of things, but we're going to start with this particular aspect of it. So let's do a deep dive there to get the team the information they need to build that part of the solution, and then get that out into the hands of users, whether it's they're actually using it in their day-to-day or they're just testing it out. And then based on their feedback, adjust so that when we're tackling the next part of the solution, we can use what we learned from that bit to how we kind of describe and explain the part we're working on now, which is a lot more satisfying than spending a bunch of time building this great epic, and by that I mean a very long document, and finding out we're constantly reworking it because of the assumptions we made back when we didn't know anything, proved out to be wrong. So that's probably, if you think of one of the main activities that business analysts in the past have done, which is kind of describing the solution effectively. That's probably the biggest change where Agile has come about, and I think it's come about for the better.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if I'm checking our comments to see if anybody is going to say this, but I feel like when we talk about doing some level of analysis or understanding to build that bigger picture, if people are hearing, well, that's waterfall. We don't do waterfall here, but that's not what we're talking about here. We are not building big requirements, but I think what you're saying is we are building an understanding of kind of all of the pieces that might be developed without going too deep. And I often wonder if people are waiting to get permission to do that, or are wanting to be told to do that. And then because that's not probably going to come, if they feel like, well, if nobody has asked me to do it, it must not be valuable. I think that's a way that we potentially hurt ourselves as business analysts working in this model.
I've mentioned when we were prepping for this and I mentioned it in my intro that for a while there I was an Agile coach.
Mhm.
And one of the things I realized was my most effective tools when doing coaching was realizing that what I was primarily doing was giving people permission to do what makes sense in their job.
Okay. Yeah.
One of which is that if we're starting a new effort, and if you're going to be at BBC and happen to get to the tutorial sessions on the first day, I'm going to talk through this a little bit more. But if you think about products actually going through a life cycle, and I'm not just talking about the work to get them built, but once you get them built, you're continuously doing things with them until you finally decide 20, 30 years down the road, it's time to pull the plug and replace it with something. And so the motions you take as you're going through that change based on where it is in its life cycle. But at its very beginning, one of the first things you got to do is understand what problem is it you're trying to solve, and then what does that solution look like, from a very broad perspective, but very narrow understanding of it. narrow being very shallow, I guess that would be the right word. And then start figuring out what's the first smallest set of things that we can put together to see, is this even going to make sense for us to do it? But you got to understand the big problem first. So when I was working at an agriculture company, we were replacing a 20-year-old pricing system. We spent 6 weeks, and by we, I mean me and the engineers and designer that were on the team, going through and talking with the people using the current system to understand their process and understand how they used it today. Not getting so much hung up on exactly replicating the existing system, because it was built in Power Builder, and there were a lot of things that had been built on over the years to take care of bugs that would exist in the system, but understand what was the real process they were trying to do, and how could we best enable that going forward. So we had to do process modeling. We had to do sketching some user interfaces. We had to do talking about data. We had to talk about business rules. Again, great opportunity for business analysis thinking, because that's just right. That's the bailiwick. That's what we do. Had to understand all that to know how can we best structure this new product that we're building.
What you describe in my mind is a form of leadership, that we can help to the organization and the stakeholders to understand what exactly is happening, so that we are getting to the root of the thing that needs to be solved. And there's real value in that, because if you want to whatever, be faster, better quality, I don't know who said this quote, but like, understanding what the problem is what 95% of the solution, because then you can just spend your time on really the thing that needs to be solved. So I think that's a form of leadership. I also like that we need to give ourselves permission. But you and I have also talked that sometimes some of these things might have to be a little stealth, because we may have people that say, well, we don't do business analysis, or we don't have a business analysis phase, or we don't work waterfall, because they think it's waterfall. What
So
what do we do?
I have, looking back, I think I've made a career on doing things that, while they're not completely restricted, they're not also explicitly required as well. It actually started back in the early 2000s when I first found out about Agile. At that time, I was working with a group that did data warehousing and business intelligence. And if you ever wanted to find an area, maybe still, that doesn't think that Agile applies to them, it's big, huge databases and health insurance companies. And so at that point in time, and I was still trying to figure it out and hadn't done it before, was basically taking the ideas I got from this book I found on the discount table by Scott Ambler called Agile Modeling.
Yep.
And figuring out, how can I apply that to this Blue Cross Blue Shield related data warehouse I'm working on right now. And it wasn't, and what I found out through there is that you weren't helped by saying, hey, we should do this because it's Agile. People could care less. But we should do this because it'll help us figure out what it is we're trying to do. Then it went from that to, again, like you said, now it was with this pricing system, it was basically saying, well, we really should apply some business analysis techniques here, but it wasn't, I'm applying these techniques because they're business analysis techniques. It was, we should do these things so that we can get a better understanding of what this process is now, because the entire team working on this is a bunch of consultants that haven't been to this company and haven't worked in this industry. So we got to figure that stuff out. And if we just asked the people that are using it now, one of whom was been using the tool for 20 years, this is maybe 2 years from retirement, they were going to just say, well, just give me the thing as it works right now, right?
Build what we have today.
Build what we have today, which one of the main reasons it came out later that we didn't want to do that is because this individual tended to introduce a lot of fat-fingered errors. And when you're changing the price of a bushel of corn, in and of itself, it may not make that big of a difference, but when you multiply it over hundreds and thousands of bushels, you start talking about some real money. So by understanding the true, what was it they trying to accomplish and what were the key rules and data, we were able to kind of identify places that we could structure the system and the interactions with it such that those pricing errors weren't nearly as easy to make.
The thing that strikes me about your story is a couple of things. That the words you were using were not agile words, they were not business analysis words, which I think have created some pushback in our organizations for lots of reasons. You were just calling it what it is. We should do some modeling to understand exactly how this works
Mm-hmm.
because the stakeholders don't really understand, and we need to make sure, blah, blah, blah. I think sometimes, and this is actually another one of the boxes that we defined in that workshop, was there's a need amongst us business analysis professionals to call it business analysis, but that can be very vague. It can have baggage attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
How many organizations have you worked with who have said we don't do business, we don't do that phase. We know what we want. We don't need to do a business analysis phase. I think we don't really help ourselves when we just assume when we say, I've got to do business analysis, that people see the value in that and they will be behind us. We got to call it what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
To put that in perspective, Rich Mirnoff, who's 40 years in Silicon Valley, doing product management, coaching product managers. Mostly he works with product leaders now. One of the main stories he continuously goes back to is that if product managers, in order to them to be successful, they got to talk in the language of money. So
okay.
effectively what he's saying is that if you're, especially if you're like at the C level, you're a chief product officer or something, and you are responsible for figuring out what's the next things that the product's going to have on the roadmap and things like that. The worst thing you could do is go in there and start talking about roadmaps and process and hypothesis and things like that. Instead, if you're talking about things like what new features would it make sense to add into the product, the best way to get support for what you're trying to do is talk about it in terms of how is it going to contribute in a product case to the revenue of the company. Talk about it in
Yeah.
terms of money. If you're not talking dollar signs or euros or whatever your currency is, the rest of the executive suite is going to check out. And I think that's a very similar situation for business analysts, even if you're working on internal products or internal systems. It's understand how your company makes money and understand how your company spends money. And that on the surface might seem like, well, that's very simple. But you'd be surprised how many people don't really understand how their company makes money, especially if you happen to be working on something that's a little bit removed from that. But what you want to
Yes.
do is, if you find yourself in that situation, get real clear on how your business makes money and spends money, and then figures out how what you're working on contributes to that. And if it
I,
doesn't, that's a clue that you might need to be thinking about, how can I get myself in a position where I am working on something like that? Because with the way the economic climate is today and the business climate is today, there are a few things that you can do to kind of make yourself a little bit more secure. And one of them is making sure you're closer to the key operations of your business.
that is, I think, really good advice, just in general. Because you're right. If we don't have that collateral, if we are seen as people that put deliverables together that don't result in something, we could be some of those folks that get moved on, that become redundant
Mm-hmm.
in organizations. So I think it is important for us to be able to understand how our organizations work and the language of, there's a word I'm looking for here, but like the power language or something like that. Like what gets people's attention. And what you're describing is almost a form of storytelling. If
Mm-hmm.
I can incorporate those words and tie my actions into the things that are most important, it is a way of telling a story that will get people's opinions. And storytelling might be a too big of a word there, but whatever it is to get their attention, that's what we want to do. That's who we want to be having those conversations with. Um, and I would be remiss, because we did talk a little bit, if we did not talk about that vague, fuzzy word, value, that we
Mm-hmm.
sometimes use when we talk about the things that we produce. And I know you feel a certain kind of way about this, as do I. Maybe tell folks, what do you think about when business analysis professionals say, "Well, I bring value. Of course they need
Mhm.
me in Agile."
So, I have a love-hate relationship with the term business value, and I've had this perspective on it for a while, even back when I was one of the very few business analysts that were trying to be very active in the Agile space, along with Chris Matz and Ellen Gottesdiener, were the main ones back in the day. And the thing that always struck me is that, and again, because Agile software development sprung about from a bunch of developers figuring out how they could be more effective developing software, um, when it came around to deciding what stuff they were going to work on, they said, well, we need to talk directly to the customer. And the customer, I'm sure they know how to figure out what it is we should be building. So I'm sure they just prioritize based on business value, and left it at that. And for the longest while, all the different approaches, basically they'd go so far and then they'd just kind of yada, yada, yada over how you made priority decisions. Um, my view on business value is it's sort of like obscenity. It's kind of one of those, you'll know it when you see it, but it's very fuzzy. So it's not very helpful for people that are trying to figure out, well, how do I use that to know whether to make decisions or not? Um, and what I have found, again, is it's going back to that idea of understanding how your organization makes money and spends money, and how you're contributing to that. And effectively, that when you're making decisions about what should we do on this thing related to our understanding of that, and understanding on related to understanding how our organization tries to help our customers solve problems, tie-in is kind of where business value is really meant to be. But I found that if you continue to use the word business value, it still keeps that loosey-goosey thing. So adopting another idea from product management space, Matt LeMay recently came out with a book called Impact First Product Teams, which also he in there basically said is that if you're working on a team and you can't associate what you're doing directly to, again, how the organization is making or spending money, you could be in a problem. So don't worry about, are you doing things the right way? Worry about, are we doing things that help us drive impact? So I tend to use impact more just as a reminder. It says, let's be a little bit more specific about what it is.
Yeah.
And go from there. And so whenever I hear the word business value, I just kind of chuckle a little bit and think, okay, yeah. So what do you really mean by that? And how are you really making decisions about what we should be doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I have tried to take that word value out when describing the things that I do or what I bring. Words like impact, results, outcomes. People, I think, can visualize what that means a bit better than something that is just value. So I think, as we're talking about this, and if people were thinking, hey, they're not talking about agile practices or agile ceremonies. What's agile about any of this? Um, I think what we're talking about here is agility. We're talking about ways of working that make it possible for organizations to achieve that, whatever those goals are that they're wanting to achieve. Like, that's really agility. It's not the other stuff. Um, so yeah.
And there are times when I get to be cynical. There are other times I get to be pedantic.
Okay.
And the interesting thing with so first of all, yes, on the core aspect of it's how folks work, I would agree with you. I've also found that unfortunately people have started adopting the term agility to imply something different, but use it as a marketing language. So that's kind of why maybe I reacted that way a little bit to it.
Yeah.
But it really is, it's more describing how you approach work more so than specific things you're going to do. And the reason for that is because we all tend to work in similar but significantly different contexts, right?
Hmm.
Um, that it's helpful to understand how people similar contexts work to you, but you understand what context they're in, how that relates to your context, and what changes you need to make. in order for it to work for in your particular case. And if you want to refer to thinking through that process as agility, great. I'm all for that. Problem I have is that agility, once Agile stopped selling as a marketing term, the next term that got picked up was agility. So I don't usually say that much of that either.
Yeah, no, and that's right. Even when we wrote a paper about that at IABA, we used the term nimble. We wanted to really kind of separate that out. But you're right, it is about just better ways of working, and I think that's what we've been talking about. By the way, I popped up. You said context, and I remember that we had a listener who also said context is key. That's really important to the way that we work. Well, I tell you what, we've got some comments and we've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
Why don't we take a few of those? I will pop this up. So Juan has the first thought. Normally in Agile, the framework does not explicitly define this role, meaning business analysis. So it can be confused with the product owner due to its similarities. And I wonder what you think about that, either from a recovered Agile coach or current product manager. What's the confusion and what's the fix for this?
So one of my talks at BBC is BAs are product people too. And in there, I kind of talk about the similarities and differences and overlap between product management, product managers, product owners, and business analysts. The only consistency, and this applies both to product roles and frankly to business analysis roles, the only consistency in all of those things is there is no consistency from one organization to another.
Yeah.
Yes, Agile framework primarily based on the use of the product owner. This is referring to Scrum. And again, so the guys that created Scrum were basing off the organizations they had worked at. They probably didn't have business analysts at that particular organization for one reason or another. That doesn't change the fact that in order to be an effective product owner, a lot of your toolkit has to be very similar to what you will find in the, especially the the Agile extension to the BA body of knowledge, because that's just what you need to do in order to understand the problem you're trying to solve. So the thing that I've gone to there is it's helpful to have an idea of what the different roles are, but at the end of the day, you need to understand what your organization's expectations are of the title you hold and figure out what do I need to do to kind of be successful in that? And then also, is that different based on a particular role I have in a given effort I'm working on or a given team I'm working on? So you can use all of the different various perspectives out there as guidelines, but you still have to figure out what does it actually mean for this particular organization.
Right, for this organization. And I think that, again, context is going to be key to that. And also, sometimes you might be able to see some of the gaps because organizations might be very prescriptive in what one role does or the other. And as business analysis professionals, sometimes we can see the gaps and can offer up other ways, other capabilities that we can bring to the table. So, all right, so next comment here is from Divya. I was told business analysis is part of the development team, and there is no specific mention of business analysis in the Agile RACI. And yeah, you're right. I think I am going to hold on to that thing that you just said, which was maybe in the organizations that those guys at the ski lodge worked with, they didn't have that role. Context. If they had not seen that role in their organizations, they wouldn't have built for it. I actually like this as an explanation.
It's either, so there's a couple things that the first one is a little bit more charitable. The second potential explanation is they did have business analysts. Those particular individuals weren't very good at doing business analysis the way we'd like to have it done. And so therefore the perception of that role was tainted from the beginning. I don't know which it was.
Yeah.
But it could be either of those explanations.
And maybe a third explanation could be they had developers and testers, those roles. They had really competent people that could do that additional stuff. And it just wasn't a thing that had to be explicit. I like all of those explanations. So Let's see. Let's next item here. This is from Roman. The worst examples of waterfall projects are similar to the majority of the agile projects. So we didn't talk about waterfall today,
Mhm.
but I feel like there is a growing sense of sarcasm, whatever, cynicalness, if that's a word, against waterfall. It's like, well, if agile is bad, waterfall is also bad because it's at the other end of the spectrum.
Waterfall was when Agile was first coming out. Waterfall was the great Satan. I'll just go ahead and say it for Agile advocates. And the interesting thing is, I don't necessarily know that if the term waterfall was actually even used prior to people starting to advocate for Agile software development.
Hmm.
And when it was used, it was certainly offered up as a pejorative, much like, and this is, I'm going to throw out my misunderstanding of UK history here. Much like the Tories and Whigs, the terms first came about. They first came about as insults to the other party. But miraculously, somewhere along the line, they actually proudly took those labels, and you can see it now in published stuff that people proudly take the helm of Waterfall, right? What So I tend to use phase based and everything because it's basically, and I did this too when I was first working in software development. I was working in this one company, and things were very chaotic. And I think this is what the poster is trying to get at here, is that you thought you were working in phase based things, but things were very chaotic. There just wasn't a lot of discipline at all. And so when we were trying to convince, and this was, we were developing programs to support marketing initiatives, we were trying to convince the salespeople, we were explaining, here's how we build software, and think of it as like building a house, right? So it's the typical, you do your blueprints and stuff, until I found out about Agile and stuff like that. So it's interesting how waterfall was initially the bad thing. Then there were some people that prefer working in that fashion that say, and sometimes it's an appropriate for their particular setting. I would be hard pressed to know any people that are doing a lot of heavily software development where phase based makes a lot of sense. But okay, we could argue that point. They grasp onto that term and are proud of it. And the other thing that's interesting is that now, 20 years later or 25 years later, Agile has become the new waterfall, from the standpoint that now, if we're going to use a pejorative term to refer to any practice that we don't think is appropriate anymore, we use Agile.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree, and I know there is that growing chorus of agile naysayers, which I is kind of unbelievable to me. But given given how it is transformed over the years, I think it is probably a fair it is fair. Um, so let's see. I Here's a couple
Well,
of other things.
one quick
Yeah.
thing on that is, and I would say the reason for the naysayers now, my guess is, it's similar to the explanation for why BAs weren't mentioned in Scrum, is one of those three reasons. Even though they haven't even worked in it, they did try it in an organization where it just failed, or they worked at an organization that effectively was doing some of the same principle-based ideas. So I'm thinking mostly startups. It's, again, what do we need to do to get done?
Right.
And again, that would be they never actually worked in that particular fashion. So they're going to conclude that, oh yeah, this is terrible because their experience was so crappy. But it was probably because it wasn't really, it was more along the lines of they were most likely, the goal was to be agile as opposed to actually do software development effectively.
Yeah, and if I hadn't had that first experience with um, uh, that that approach to agile, um, then I would think that agile doesn't work because anything I've seen subsequent to that was just not. It was not well done, and I certainly didn't feel like I was working better or collaborating better. So I think you're right, and I'm wondering if the early successes, clearly for you, the early successes that you saw kept you hanging on. until it became like, oh no, this is somewhere this turned bad. I don't know how this
Well,
happened.
ironically, I was my early involvement in Agile was where I was trying to do it guerrilla fashion, and I wasn't actually involved in any way, shape, or form with introducing it officially in an organization until I was Agile coaching.
Okay.
So it was always, for me, it was always where can we attack specific problems with specific things to try out to make things
Mm,
better, as opposed
yeah.
to we're going to do this and we're going to forget why we started doing it, and the end goal ends up becoming being agile as opposed to actually just making our organization more effective.
And I wonder if some of those problems started to arise because we were trying to scale it instead of thinking in terms of let's focus on our team and our way of working. Okay, now let's think about getting a 200, 500, 1000 person organization doing it. And then you kind of lose sight of exactly how you're going to make this happen.
Because when you scale it, you have to then say, in order for this to really work at that scale, we're going to have to dramatically change how the organization works, and that threatens a lot of people, and they're responsible for making the organization work that way. So then you have to start marketing the approach to something that they'd be comfortable with, and you end up with scaled agile framework.
Exactly. And I've got to take care of those middle managers who were like, "Oh, wait a minute, people are going to work autonomously and self-directed. Whoa, what about me?
Mm-hmm.
What about my job?" Yeah, you make a great point. That would just be my kind of thought of where we started to see things go south. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, I think um I think that we are just about done today. So this has been a
If
great conversation. I can tell we've
Yeah,
got lots of
I prevented you from reading that last question. If we have a minute,
Oh, 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 yeah, here, let me take this one. I think this one, yeah, so far in my experience. Oh, yeah, I did want to ask you about this.
yes.
I've seen very few organizations who try to be pure agile. It's hybrid. And I really feel like that's kind of the norm these days is something like hybrid. What do
Mm-hmm.
you think about that?
I've never understood the use of the term hybrid when it
Okay.
comes to adopting an agile software development approach. Because what it used to mean is we're going to do some projects waterfall and we're going to do some projects agile, and I'm like, if you're willing to switch up your approach, hopefully based on the characteristics of that particular effort, not based on the preferences of the people working on it, aren't you in effect working in an agile fashion already? So
Okay.
a couple key things there. The more an organization talks about being agile, the less likely they are working in an agile fashion. Because again,
Okay.
they've mistaken being agile for the goal as opposed to just doing things more effectively. And again, if you really look at doing, operating in an agile fashion as being short feedback cycles, doing what seems to be most appropriate, in some cases that might look like something that some people would usually describe as waterfall. But
Yeah.
if you're doing the right approach for that particular context, it's not a bad thing. And who cares
Yeah.
what it's called?
Exactly. It goes back to just call it what it is. Stop trying to use these words that have now just they're nonsensical because they've we don't really have good definitions of them. So, all right. So note to self.
And
Hybrid
and
isn't well
and
explained either.
and one quick thing on hybrid when we talking about where we work. I just have to throw this in. Hybrid, as far as return to office things, I think hybrid is really just saying that purgatory we're in before, as we're trying to decide how to force everyone to come back to work 5 days a week. I think that's what hybrid means. But,
That's fair. Yeah, that's a fair definition. All right. Well, on that note, Kent, I want to thank you again for joining us today.
mhm.
Always great to talk to you. And because you're a little bit of a cynic about Agile, this has been very cathartic for me today that I'm not alone. I'm not alone. Um, and best of luck on your 3 talks that you're giving at BBC. And that is coming up in, gosh, about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. in Phoenix? Yeah. All right. Well, take care and we will talk soon.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
All right. Oop. And so we are wrapping up for today. Maybe this has gotten you to think about some things that you might need to know or need to think differently about Agile. I sure hope it is. We will be back in 2 weeks. And when I see you again, we're going to be talking about Gen AI and information mapping. And we've got someone from the Information Mapping Institute who is going to come and talk about this. And if you're not familiar with information mapping, well, you're going to be learning some about it. So join us 2 weeks from today, and we'll see you then. Bye.